Okay, so something kind of serendipitous happened that led to this video and the next one that's going to be right after this. And that is the fact that I had already planned to do the next two videos, this one and the next one, but I was trying to figure out how to obtain copies of a couple of the movies that I had thought of for these next two, and it turned out that both of them, because they both kind of seem a bit more, they certainly have their audiences and people that know about them in certain circles, especially, horror fans and stuff like that. But other than that, it seems like as far as, mainstream access goes, they're kind of off the radar. So I was wondering how difficult they would be to find, and it just so happened that both of them happen to be in this four-pack that Warner Brothers put out that, to my understanding, is out of print now, maybe? So I was very lucky to get a copy of this. And yeah, so there's going to be two videos in a row where we're dealing with two movies out of this particular four-pack, and we're going to start with this one because I wanted to do something werewolf-related, and we already did American Werewolf in London and The Howling way back however many years ago, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, and Wolf certainly was going to be like the one that I kind of went towards. And so it was going to be, do we do, Silver Bullet? Do we do Wolfen, that's also in this pack? But then I settled on Bad Moon because I kind of wanted to stay in the decade of the 90s, because I felt like that was an interesting period, where it's like, I feel like we really kind of hit the 80s when we did American Werewolf in London and The Haunting, but here, I think there's this, the whole thing about how werewolves aren't really very touched on when you look at a lot of the horror monsters, because what's especially interesting about that is the fact that I feel like you talk about how atmosphere should be more present in the horror genre in general, and that's usually where the best stuff comes from, and it feels like there's some really untapped places here, because werewolves seem like the part of the genre that lends itself the most to atmosphere when you think about imagery involving, full moons and fog and, isolated locations and stuff like that. And the way that these utilize that is also something that I find interesting when you're looking at some... With Bad Moon, we're obviously in a pretty isolated location, whereas in Wolf, we're, in the city, and we're using, the most isolated we get is, the middle of Central Park. But it still manages to have the same sort of vibe to it. And so, going into these, let's start off with the fact that it's kind of amazing in itself that Mike Nichols, given where his, status will always be, but also was at the time, and then coming out with a werewolf movie kind of seems totally out of left field. He had a relatively eclectic lineup of movies, but this one in particular does kind of feel like it came from out of nowhere, especially given that not only does it have, pretty much the whole cast list is people that don't typically show up in a movie unless they're here for a reason, whether it be Nicholson or Pfeiffer or Christopher Plummer or James Spader or whoever. It's a pretty incredible cast. I'd even throw Kate Nelligan in there. But on top of that, look at the technical credits to it, because you do have, Rick Baker doing makeup, obviously. There's Morricone doing the score. The cinematographer is the guy that did, he did some Fellini movies, he did All That Jazz, he did The Leopard, the movie with the massive party, and another movie by that director, Rocco and His Brothers. And that's pretty impressive in itself, but then you keep going. The editor is the guy that, I think he did most of Nichols' filmography, but he also did stuff like Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown. And it's just looking at the credits of this movie in total is insane. And for a werewolf movie especially, it seems so out of nowhere, but at the same time, like I said, the werewolf subgenre just lends itself so much to the technical aspects of it and telling the story in that way, in this very visual sense. And you pretty much get that right away. Like I said, even the first shot of the movie, even though it's the most obvious shot you can get to start off a werewolf movie, it's so tone-setting in not just, telling a werewolf story, but telling a horror story in general. Like I said, it's kind of amazing to me that werewolves are there's so few movies compared to, vampires and zombies and all the other stuff that we tend to see. So maybe it's because there's not a whole lot you can do with it technically, but I mean, I feel like you can say that about any of them. They all have their like established rules, and that you can branch off and do other things. And I feel like these two movies in particular, it's not only is it interesting that they were kind of close together and in the same decade, because the '90s weren't an ideal decade for horror. Like when you look at the really big picture. But these two really effective werewolf movies that managed to break out around the same time feel like this kind of odd anomaly to me, and that's kind of how we got to this point and how I kind of chose to do these two together. Um, so as far as I guess we can stay on Wolf for a little bit. It is interesting not only because we have an actor of Nicholson's caliber at the start of this, but it's like it does seem like regardless of all the roles he's known for and the fact that he's so legendary and one of the greatest actors of all time, he seems like he has a particular look, and that look suits two particular things that he was born to play. That being the devil, which he did in The Witches of Eastwick, and a werewolf, which he did here. So it's like he was completely and totally utilized. If you want to throw the Joker in there also, that works too. Like I said, when you talk about the way his particular look has been utilized, I feel like this is another one of those things where a werewolf was kind of inevitable. Especially with his willingness to go under makeup, like we saw with stuff like the Joker and stuff like that. Some of the crazier scenes in the Witches of Eastwick. But what's interesting about this also is that when you look at a werewolf movie, of course, there's going to only be so much ground that's covered by the werewolf stuff. So there is going to be this sort of side plot always going on. And with this, I guess you could actually say it's the A plot, and it's almost like the B plot is the werewolf stuff. Where the plot here in Wolf is this back and forth between his job and how that's affecting his relationship with his wife, and this whole thing with James Spader betraying him and Christopher Plummer coming in and firing him, and this whole thing. And what's interesting about this, and this might seem a bit hyperbolic, but like I said, with Nichols doing it and this cast, and honestly even the writing up to this point, I feel like the whole plot about his job and his wife could basically have just been a movie by itself. And it would have been engrossing and entertaining enough, I would think. Especially with this nature that Jack has, where he can just kind of seemingly strut through a scene, whether he's in this sort of, bright mood kind of place, or if he's like downtrodden, or if he's planning to kill somebody. He can walk into the room with the same kind of energy for all those different emotions. But here he does really get to play with that, where we do get some upbeat Jack, but also some very sort of downplayed. But the thing is when Jack is downplayed, you're always kind of waiting for the burst to happen. And I don't know if that could be more perfectly suited for the werewolf setup, for this to be a guy that goes into his job like this and has been put in the situations that he's been put in. And that he's eventually going to reach a breaking point, and it's like, why not reach his breaking point while he's right in the middle of going through this new transformation into a werewolf, and it's actually kind of perfect. And seeing that transformation play out, where we like see his senses start to get heightened, and he can hear everything in the building. His sense of smell gets much more potent. There's the whole thing where we actually get that shot where he can hear just like all through the building and all through each floor and everything. That's amazing. And going on to that, talking about seeing his transformation and the process of him going through it and figuring out what it is, the idea of accidentally sleeping all day and into like 12 hours later and not realizing it's the same time, only the sun has gone down. There's two sides to a lot of these monster movies, mainly, werewolf movies and vampire movies, and that is, you can have a movie that's from the perspective of the person changing, or you can have a movie that's from the outsider perspective, and where the monster is kind of much more of the antagonist of the story, and you have your protagonist that's potentially in danger, and the people around them are potentially in danger. And I feel like we're going to get that split up here. With Wolf, we get it from the perspective of the person changing. And Bad Moon is kind of much more from the Muriel Hemingway perspective, where it's her brother, Michael Pare, that's come in, that's transforming, and the fact and how she kind of has to figure that out for herself, and we as the audience know what's going on in Bad Moon pretty much, but it does still feel like there's this sort of gradual revealing where we are sort of getting, maybe not learning stuff, but getting confirmations as she's learning, for what we are under the impression that we're figuring out. And we were talking about Nichols here. Bad Moon comes from Eric Red, who it's much less surprising coming from him than it is from Nichols. Eric Red being the guy that wrote and directed the original Hitcher. Actually, I think he wrote the remake as well. And he also co-wrote Near Dark with Bigelow. So, yeah, this isn't really all that surprising, but it does come from a book. The book titled Thor After the Dog. And it is interesting. This is a book that I would actually like to track down and see how it reads. Because another interesting thing about this movie, especially coming from a book, is that it is a mere 79 minutes, which is kind of crazy for a movie that was released in theaters and not straight to video and has a whole, big production. It doesn't feel cheap or anything like that. The only sort of technical difference from it and any other werewolf movie, the main one, is it is so incredibly short, so unusually short. Yet I think the amazing thing about that is, while it does feel swift, it never really feels rushed. It never feels rushed, but it also doesn't feel like it's dragging in any particular place. It feels like a very full story that reaches all the beats that it needs to, and in this very, very concise manner. And that's not to say that, Wolf barely breaking 2 hours is lesser because of that, or maybe less concise because of that. Because if there's something that does kind of make Wolf a bit longer than it might need to be, is something that I feel like is very unfortunate to say, and that is the Pfeiffer storyline. Because I do feel like, it does feel like there's something here, there is a chemistry here in the Nicholson-Pfeiffer scenes, but as far as her character's involvement in the story, I'm not saying that it's pointless and that it could be cut, but it doesn't feel like it has the weight that it probably should. There is this relationship between the two of them where they both kind of have it out for Christopher Plummer for two different reasons. And how that kind of seems like their bond at first, and then how this kind of grows. And the way that their scenes are shot are very well done. One of the great things also about the way Wolf is shot is talking about, the werewolf atmosphere and what comes with that territory, and seeing, the huge contrast between how really, really bright and colorful the daylight scenes are, and then, how ominous and sort of bleak and foggy the night scenes are. And when you see the Pfeiffer scenes, and you've got, these very picturesque scenes where it's, when they're on the field and she's, on the horse, and just the green of, I don't know if it's the Blu-ray transfer, just in general how it's shot, but the grass looks so green, so perfectly green, storybook green. And then there's, the shot where they're in front of the water that looks really great. And it's, it does feel like the visuals are telling their love story more than, the dialogue and their actual, and them actually interacting is, interestingly enough. But the thing about Bad Moon is the relationship now is between a brother and a sister. So it is much closer. While Pfeiffer really does sell her scenes, where it's in her early scenes she's kind of seductive and that sort of, potentially unobtainable figure because she looks like Michelle Pfeiffer. But then later on, once she knows everything, and we see how the character the way she plays fear is very convincing. But here, obviously this is a bond that goes much farther back, being brother and sister, and the fact that there is a certain point in Bad Moon where it's one of those things where you basically you either run with it or you don't. And that is the motive for her brother even being here. Because when you see the setup where we get this opening scene, and it's very jarring because it does go from erotic to horrific in a matter of seconds. And it's one of the things that is it makes it very effective and I would say this is kind of maybe overkill, but I actually think it suits the movie well. the movie is very, very gory and very gruesome. The kills are insane and disgusting, but I actually think that's quite fitting. And the thing, and especially when you're sort of contrasting it from the way this scene plays out, from how it starts off versus where it ends up, and it shows really the gruesome nature of the threat that he is. Because there's not a lot of gore in Wolf. There's actually a lot of areas where Wolf is very sort of held back, where Wolf is very minimal on the gore, and Wolf is also very minimal on the makeup, interestingly enough. And obviously Bad Moon goes all in on both, and that's incredibly fun. Like I said, it's not really... Like, another reason I wanted to put these two together is you would think the whole versus angle would be, oh, I like this because it did this instead of this one because it did it the other way. But I'm actually fascinated by how much they both work, despite the different ways they took on how to do the genre, whether it be the wolf makeup or how the kills are handled and how in your face it's going to be, or how sort of, reined in it might be. But here, yeah, so we do start off with these really gruesome kills, and then we learn rather quickly that this werewolf that's now terrorizing the area is probably him. So the question is he's got his sister and he's got his nephew here, both of which he cares very deeply about. And Perret's performance is very, very good, and the way he's able to balance, like, being really concerned about them and kind of playing that off, but also, like, the fact that he knows, and, like, you can kind of see this double-sidedness, too. He's trying to show, oh, I just don't want you guys to get hurt, but it's in the back of his mind, you can actually see his wheels turning as he's thinking, I don't want you to get hurt by me, but I can't say that. And the way he conveys that is very convincing. And then, obviously, as it goes on, and the sort of... They talk earlier about when Thor attacks, and the idea of, I think it's the sheriff says something like, once a dog has tasted blood, he's going to eventually want more of that, and it's going to make him dangerous. And that's basically what we're seeing Perret's change go through, where he starts off this way, but the more he's the wolf and the more he attacks, the more we can see, like, the evil side sort of taking over, to the point that you could almost be convinced that the evil side was always there and everything else was a front, and he is here to kill them. But luckily, he left a sort of journal behind that Mariel Hemingway finds and reads, and this is where it's like, either you're on board with this or you're not. You gotta decide to run with it or not. A lot of people don't like the scene in Interstellar where Nolan had Anne Hathaway say, if there's one thing that transcends all of this, transcends time and space, it's love. And people seem to really hate that. So I'm curious how people would feel if Bad Moon was a much more well-known movie, like in a mainstream sense, that the plan here is to come and stay with these people that he hopes remain safe, despite the fact that he's turning into a werewolf. And his reason, you might think, wouldn't you want to be as far away from your loved ones as possible? His reasoning in this journal that she finds is that he's hoping that love will prevail and love will be the cure to the werewolf. Like, if he's around them, then that will stave off the werewolf turning. However, you could say that's a character flaw and not a writing flaw, because clearly we learn that that would be a bad way to go. That would be like a bad story turn if it worked. If it turned out that love was what needed to happen in order to stave the werewolf off. The fact that that doesn't happen, and that is wrong, I'm willing to run with it. I'm willing to run with the fact that that's why he came here. And it's just a very, very unfortunate character flaw. So, yeah, I'm good with that. But, and obviously, we're talking about, the sort of heroes of the movie, and you're talking about from the other perspective. It is interesting also, we talked about sort of Mariel Hemingway here, but honestly, there's a reason the book Bad Moon is based off is called Thor. I do think, once again, with Bad Moon not being as mainstream as it could be, and probably should be, I would put Thor under probably one of the most underappreciated movie dogs ever. like one of the great heroic dogs in cinema history, is clearly Thor in this movie. This is a horror movie. This is a werewolf movie, and it might have one of the saddest dog taken away scenes, dog taken away from the kids scenes ever. Much more so than any movie that's actually like a family movie that's actually focused on a dog and that's the whole story. This probably does even more effectively than 99% of those. And like to set it up that the dog is the hero, it's actually quite appropriate too, because the whole dog versus dog thing we've got going on. That basically becomes our climax. But to come back over here to Wolf, we do have something here that I don't really recall being very present in Bad Moon, and that is a focus on humor, like kind of dark humor, which might be kind of the one thing Bad Moon is missing for the most part. Like there's a line maybe here and there. For some reason, it's always made me laugh the way Mason Gamble, who's the nephew who played Dennis the Menace a few years prior, when he goes to break out Thor and the lights come on and you feel like he's caught, and just the way he yells, "Oh shit," has always just been really funny to me. But I don't even know if that's intentional or not. But here, with Wolf definitely has a very sort of dark sense of humor. And it's kind of like, when you look at, Nicholson's previous movies, and Nicholson in general just kind of having that sort of, like, kind of knowing sense in sort of any story that he's in. Like like Nicholson, I always feel like knows more than he lets on whenever you see him in a movie. He's always got like those knowing glances and the way his eyebrows move and stuff like that. And so you get the sense that there is something very, very dry but also very dark about what's going on here in some of the interactions. Like, as Jack's going through his transformation, there's the scene when the sandwich is sitting on the secretary's desk, and he just takes the top piece of bread off and just starts eating the meat off of it, while looking the secretary directly in the eye and talking about something else entirely. And then he just puts the bread back on, and he even does like one of those final pats to leave it there. And just moments like that pretty much go completely unspoken about is something that's going to really, like, that kind of sense of humor is going to inject life into sort of anything. Even if the movie doesn't necessarily need necessarily an injection of life, those little moments are always going to kind of provide that anyway, and kind of add this sort of extra level of the sort of, this sort of dark tone. What's the word I'm looking for? It's on the tip of my tongue and I can't think of it. But it's definitely this knowing sense of knowing what's going on here, what kind of movie it is, and setting a particular tone. But going on also, we do have the suspense ramped up a little bit when we introduce the Richard Jenkins character, who is a detective, and that's something that could probably seem like, a really tired trope, and one that we don't necessarily need, because, like, the police work in Batman, it sets up that idea of, somebody's getting off, but the fact that they think it's a dog kind of sets up this whole other thing, like this whole other vibe that you don't particularly see, because usually it's like, we suspect this person, and usually it's the person that is actually doing it. But there is a sort of twist on that also in Wolf, because there is the case where they do set up that it's a reveal that Spader is a werewolf, but I do feel like that's much more obvious than before the pieces of the movie start to fall into place. But there is that whole vibe of setting up that we have the werewolf character, and then people die in the middle of the night, and then there's an investigation, and it's like, oh, we know who did it. But the fact that there's another werewolf out there, and the fact that we're not seeing the deaths themselves, does kind of set up this mystery. And maybe if it's your first time watching it, maybe it won't even occur to you there could be another one, even though there is a blatant scene of Jack biting Spader very early in the movie, that just seems to go unacknowledged until the ultimate reveal. That's right. Like I said, I'm not even sure if it's supposed to be a reveal, like a huge, huge reveal, or if it's something that we're supposed to just kind of be waiting to happen. Because that doesn't seem like the way it's supposed. That seems to kind of go against the rules of storytelling a little bit. And the last person I expect to do that is Mike Nichols. But still, I do like how that trope does still kind of set up this suspense angle where it's like now there's some where it's not just, you know, when will Jack turn and who will he harm, but also is he gonna get, you know, caught for doing it is a whole other thing also, which I can get on. Like I said, it's a trope, but it's a trope that I don't mind. And there's always moments that are gonna like it's gonna lead to moments of suspense where we're kind of as he's sort of poking and prodding, and we're kind of waiting to see. And there's also the way Jack has that very real response to learning of his wife's death, and how you can see the change in mood, and how that's kind of a point to where even the people that could say, like, you know, oh, it's obviously him because he's the werewolf we've been following, can have this sense of doubt, and it's like to kind of see that from the Jenkins character's perspective also. There's something there that I do like, even though, like I said, if all of it seems obvious, like it's an obvious trope to bring a cop and a detective in and all that, and it's obvious that, you know, Spader is another werewolf that's running around, and he's probably going to be even more evil because he was kind of, you know, leaning towards that to begin with as a human being, and you know it's Spader, but that's the thing also is what I like about the limited makeup is that they're essentially just sort of amplified. Like, Werewolf Jack is just like amplified Jack, and Werewolf Spader's just sort of amplified Spader. But it's like, that's actually pretty perfect. And I don't know that I'd have it any other way. And so, and it's like, it's kind of the point also where you could say characters tend to get typecast, but sometimes, oftentimes typecasting can kind of suck, especially for an actor's career. But there's also those times that come along where it occurs to you why typecasting is a thing, because sometimes it just really works, and it can work most of the time, if not every time, for certain people. And I feel like James Spader especially is one of those people where you could give him the same role 30 times in a row, but he can do it so well and in such a wonderfully theatrical way. But also, you know, throw in some subtleties here and there to where not every character would be... They could be the same character type, but not necessarily the same kind of character. And it takes somebody of Spader's caliber to be able to pull that off. And Spader is also, you know, really one of the best that we have out there right now also. It may not occur to people because he's only really known... Like, these days, he's only really, really known for like 2 or 3 specific roles. But he can definitely do a lot with one character type, and I feel like that's demonstrated just as well here. And over here, like I said, we talked about the minimal makeup, and here we do have a whole giant creature, which, like I said, is just as fun also, where it's like, where Wolf might be more character-driven movie, it makes sense that the makeup is minimal, and so it's like, it's kind of the characters that are coming through the makeup also, where it's like their personalities sort of match the werewolf that they become. And to see Pariah just turn into this giant monster. The transformation is going to be one of those things that's always... Like, I feel like Landis kind of set a precedent for the on-screen werewolf transformation. And the idea of it being like this super painful process, and very long process. And I more or less like the way that it's done in Bad Moon, even if there is a lot of animation involved. But what I do like is that the transformation is basically the climax. Like, for a werewolf movie that's 79 minutes, I kind of feel like that's good from a structural standpoint, is to kind of have the creature there, and for us to kind of know what's going on, but like I said, just having these confirmations as things go on. To have the actual, seeing the transformation in full being like the climatic moment of the movie, before, you know, the sort of final confrontation happens. I do think that's handled very well. Another thing I forgot to mention about Wolf and its sense of humor is something that appears in Bad Moon as well, and that is the marking the territory scene, where we have the scene where he pisses on Spader in the bathroom and blatantly tells him that. And like I said, there's this moment in Bad Moon where we start to see probably become more, like, get more consumed by the evil part of himself, and the part that, like, the werewolf is corrupted, I guess you could say, and is coming more to more, you know, to life within him. And so this cold-blooded moment where Thor gets taken away, and the first thing he does is piss on the doghouse to mark his territory. And I feel like there's something... It's so cold-blooded, but I also feel like there's something very darkly funny there. When you talk about these movies kind of having a dark sense of humor about them, that's something to where it's like... This movie has a certain kind of personality that's lurking that starts to rear its head. in this very... It's in a fun way. Like I said, as cold-blooded as it is, it's also a lot of fun to see Poirot really go into just the nasty nature of this character the more he gets corrupted by this. Um, and what I think I especially like about Bad Moon is, like I said, I really love Wolf for being, a character-driven movie and being able to have a balance of the two things, of, like, having an actual plot that's really, effective and engrossing without even the werewolf aspect in it, but then the werewolf aspect working just as well also. Um, as far as it being, like, just a straightforward, no nonsense werewolf movie and nothing else. Like, it's literally, if you're thinking, I just want to watch a werewolf movie, just in general, like, because you don't see many of them, and if you just have, like, an itch to watch a werewolf movie, I would say Silver Bullet is one that I go to frequently, and Bad Moon is one that really, really scratches that itch when you're looking for, like I said, obviously there's, all the classic era from, like, the 40s and stuff like that, the Chaney stuff. But if you're looking for, like, this particular era, like this 80s and 90s era, Bad Moon really is, like, there, like, how there's, especially in horror, I've noticed, because there's so many different subgenres in horror. Sometimes you're just itching for a very specific kind of horror movie. And like I said, if it's a werewolf movie, it's a really special feeling when you find a horror movie in a particular subgenre that just really scratches the itch for that subgenre. And I feel like Bad Moon really gets that in the werewolf area. Like I said, I'm not saying it's, like, my favorite werewolf movie, but it's like, if you're just looking for one, or if you wanted to, like, introduce somebody to werewolf movies, I feel like it'd be, like, a perfect starting point. And definitely up there with, like American Werewolf in London and The Howling. I've said before that I'm not actually that into The Howling, really any of that series, but, like, American Werewolf in London and stuff like that, definitely, and, the original Chaney movie, sure, but like I said, the fact that Bad Moon isn't as mainstream as it could be, especially for the genre, just because it just kind of feels so off the radar in general. I would like if it was more well known, because I feel like it does such a great job with that. Not to mention, it does end on a jump scare that might rival Carrie's. Like, it's kind of done in the same fashion, where it's like, it might seem like it's pointless in just this final scare just for the sake of it, but like I said, if we're talking, like, when jump scares were really a big effective thing, like the last scene in Carrie, I feel like it's kind of a nice sort of homage to something like that. So I'm just, yeah. So I guess, and I said, being so concise at 79 minutes also will always be a plus. Like I said, not to take away from longer ones, like I said, are more character driven, because I would say if I had to choose between the two as far as, like, what's a better, movie, like, when you take all the aspects into account, I would probably almost certainly say Wolf. But like I said, if I'm just looking for, like especially around this time of year when we're, like, at the very, very end of October, and you're just looking for that kind of movie, just like a monster movie, Bad Wolf would easily be my go-to between the two, I think. But like I said, if you're taking all aspects into account, it's Wolf all day. But I feel like there's definitely merits in Bad Moon, especially, for this time of year and just how it portrays the genre itself. And it does do that thing that might annoy people, where it throws out, the rules, where towards the beginning, Poirot's talking about stuff like, oh, it's actually not, always a full moon, and oh, it doesn't necessarily take silver and stuff like that. That might annoy some people. And sometimes it can almost be like, sometimes I don't like it because there's, like, a smugness to it, to where it's like, oh no, not that childish stuff, we're doing our own thing or whatever, where it's like it's trying to be above what it is, and so I most of the time I don't like when they do that, but Bad Moon kind of does it so nonchalantly, and that's able to kind of keep it not as strapped down, and it's kind of able to just sort of, like, be like, the way we can get to the climax without having to go, like, through certain hoops of what, like, get this certain thing and that certain thing and at this particular time or whatever, then it kind of gives it a freedom to just kind of tell its story, is something that I don't mind. And the fact that it's not really condescending about sort of throwing the rules out. It's just kind of, like, establishing its own sort of world, in this relatively modest way. So it doesn't bother me in this instance. So Is that pretty much all there is to say, I think? I'm going to assume so. So, yeah, like I said, right after this, we are talking about another movie that's in here, with a movie that's more of a modernized, updated kind of thing, even though they're not that far apart in release date. But it'll be something similar to this. So, different threat, different kind of monster, but we will talk about that very soon. So, until that, I think that's it.